All right, so welcome to the design workshop. You'll notice me turning my head a lot when I'm actually on camera because I'm using two different screens so I can see everything. So today we're going to talk about what is theatrical design. What do we mean by design? What do we mean? How does design apply in theater? And what is the process to get from what I like to call page to stage? We start with a script, and then we have to build it up into something that we can actually perform and have performers working on and have them on stage and see them and hear them and have them fit into the world of the show that they're creating. I always say, as technicians, our primary job is to support the actors in telling a specific story. The actor's job is to tell the story, and our job is to give them a world to support that. So we will start with that. I need to rearrange some stuff on my screen. Oops, that was not supposed to go like that. All right. It'd be less awkward if I didn't have 400 windows open. All right, so we're gonna start here. Lost my window. So, oh, and that messes everything up again, doesn't it? Yes, it does. All right. Right now, does that look right? No, it doesn't fit the window properly. What did I do? Okay, so it's cut off a little bit. We'll live with it. Anyway, who is a designer? So in the sense of theatrical design, I made my notes very small. Who can, and you can do this in the chat or with your microphone, who can tell me what is a theatrical designer? Like, what are the types of design that we use in theater? Anyone? All right. So probably the first things you think of are scenic designer, lighting, costume, sound, and props. Those are kind of the big five things that pretty much all productions need those designers. But fundamentally, there's actually more than that. Frequently, we also have special effects, flying, choreography, video. Depending on the nature of the show, you might have a puppet designer. You could have any number of things. Frequently, for publicity, you'll have a graphic designer who's in charge of making sure all of the material that goes out to the public for the show. So there's a lot going on design-wise in the show, even beyond the things you usually think of for design. So basically, the designers are responsible for anything that appears as part of the production that isn't an actor. The director is in charge of the actors, and the designers are in charge of kind of making everything else happen, right? So the next thing we'll talk about is, what are a designer's tools? What kind of tools do designers use? Anybody want to jump in? Okay. So we'll start with some of the obvious things: pens, pencils, CAD programs, paint, rulers, computers, that sort of thing. The things you think of when you think of design. When you look at the background of our Google image here, you know, you've got the blueprints, and costume designers frequently will paint renderings and that sort of thing. So you think of those sorts of things. But there's also color, form, movement, sound, and texture. Those are all tools that we use as designers to build the world. You know, color is kind of an obvious one for things like lighting and paint and costumes. Form, you might not think of in terms of lighting, but it is a part of lighting, whether the edges of our light are hard or soft, whether, you know, where we put shadows, that sort of thing. Same with movement. That applies to not just things like does this piece of scenery leave the stage at some point, which is an obvious form of movement? But in sound design, do we have the sound flow from right to left so that the audience hears a car go by and has that sort of spatial relationship to the world that we're building for them? Sound is not just the sound designer's job. There are other things that can contribute to that. You know, the texture of fabric in a costume. Some costumes can actually make noise. Same with like the scenic design. There may be times where what you want to hear is the footsteps of the actor, and other times you want to mute that as much as possible. And then texture, the same way, can apply to all of the different fields. Different kinds of fabric have a different feel to them. Different kinds of sound create a different environment that we're bringing our audience into. So those are all within the designer's toolkit. And in addition to that, there's the less concrete things. History figures into our design. Psychology, the society we live in, all of those sorts of things figure into our design. When you're doing a show set in Shakespearean times, you need to know a little bit about what society was like at that time. You need to know what the meanings of things were to that society that are different than how we interpret them today, and that sort of thing. So there's a lot more than just the visual elements of design that go into it when you're creating this process. So those are some of the tools that we use. And there's obviously, that list could go on and on for forever. Just about any experience in our life becomes part of our toolkit as designers. Which is why, for me, I always encourage people to explore anything they have an interest in, because even if fundamentally you want to be a designer, the wider your range of experiences, the better a designer I think you can be. All right, any questions so far? All right, so we will continue. All right, so what do we design? What is our process? So regardless of which department, electrics, scenery, costumes, whatever, we all have kind of the same thing that overall we're designing, the same set of aspects of our design. Color is obviously one. With lighting, there's a whole lot of color choice involved in how we combine colors and contrast them and that sort of thing. Costume design, very obviously, all clothing has some color to it, even if that color is black, white, or gray. That influences how we interpret the world around us. Scenery, obviously, has very distinct color choices made. One of the important things a scenic designer has to do is come up with what is called a color elevation that tells the technicians and the workers what color things are supposed to be when they are painted, and match to those colors and make those decisions. But even within the other realms, sound, you know, there's sounds that sort of fit into an environment and influence the environment and make you feel warmer or cooler or whatever, and can influence how your audience responds to the colors. Fundamentally, everything we're doing is to evoke an emotion, a response from the audience in a way that supports the story being told on the stage. The next aspect we'll look at is form. Form is the shape of things, which when you're talking about scenery, if to go back to an example, a couple of years ago when we did Les Mis, we had to decide, what did those buildings look like? How did they fit on the stage? How did the actors interact with them physically? Like, where do stairs go? Where do arches go? Are the openings arches or are they square doors? You know, which openings have doors and which ones are just openings? There is a very significant scene that happens on a bridge. What does that bridge look like? You know, you have to make decisions about how do you make it look like a bridge? How do you get, what kind of railings, what kind of decoration? All of that sort of thing goes into the environment of the world, the shapes of things. And like I mentioned, that again applies to lights, shadows and lights and patterns and that sort of thing all contribute shape to the world on stage. When you use a light that has a leaf pattern in it, that helps the audience know, okay, this scene is happening outdoors because there's shadows that look like leaves on the actors. And it doesn't even have to be like a necessarily like clearly leaves, but you know when you see the light coming through tree leaves and you get the kind of pattern on people's faces and arms and stuff, that can influence like your interpretation of where it is. So sometimes, you know, the lights are defining the location more so than the physical scenery, because in a lot of shows you end up with more locations than you can physically put on a stage, and so you have to have a way to delineate those different locations in a way other than just, okay, we're physically replacing the set with another set. The next thing we'll talk about is movement, which, like we said, moving a piece of scenery off the stage is very obviously an important thing that can happen, but sometimes it can be something much more subtle, a shift in which part of the stage is more brightly lit, which can be either, you know, you actually black out part of the stage, or it can also be, you know, you just boost one area of the stage 10 or 15%, and it's a very subtle thing where the audience doesn't necessarily even realize the lights have changed, but it shifts their focus to that one spot on the stage. It makes that spot more important. That also comes into play with things like sound. Like I mentioned, a car driving by or someone walking across a room. When you add movement to that sound, the audience goes with it. You know, their attention goes with it. So if you have those footsteps that ominously fade from right to left in the background, the audience is thinking about that cross. They're thinking about that movement, and it makes the world more real. When you use speakers behind the audience and all of a sudden out of nowhere there's a big noise, you can really like change the environment for the audience. And in terms of like costumes, you're looking at, you know, a big flowing skirt. An actor walking across the stage in something like that has a very different feel than someone in pants or a different kind of skirt or an equally big but much heavier skirt. You know, the difference between like a Victorian sort of gown where everything is very heavy and held down versus a long flowy sundress. You know, they can have the exact same size and shape of skirt and still have a very different kind of movement as they go. Sound, obviously, in any environment you're in, sound tells you a lot about where you are. There's moments in a show where you need motivated sound. If a phone rings, the sound designer has to decide what that phone sounds like. Is it a old telephone with a physical bell? Is it an electronic sound? Is it a, you know, a recognizable ringtone like the iPhone marimba sound? Those are decisions that have to be made. But you also may have scenes where what you want to do is tell the audience it's night and you're outdoors. So you'll have very subtly in the background crickets and an occasional bird chirp, stuff like that, that builds the world through sound. And then finally, texture, the difference between hard edges and soft edges and those sorts of things. So these are all aspects that we have to make decisions about as designers as we go. Any questions so far? This is super weird for me because I can see 2 of you, and usually there's like 8 or 10 or more. But hey, we'll keep going. All right, so how do we design? There are 2 important aspects of our design. There's driven design, versus artistic choice. So driven design are the things that you have to do for the show. If you are doing a show that is set in a specific location at a specific time, those decisions have been made for you. And whether that's through the script or the director's choices or that sort of thing, there are choices that are made for you from the beginning. If the script says, the show takes place, during World War II, that narrows down the choices you can make to certain things. You obviously can't use that iPhone ringtone. It doesn't make sense in that world. And when you make those kind of choices, instead of building the world for the audience, you're taking them out of that world, which is not what we want to do. And then artistic choice is the portion where you are making those decisions about color, about sound, form, movement. You're making the choices that take the concept that's on the page and in the director's mind and turn it into something real on stage. You're making the decisions about the shapes of things, the colors, all of those things we talked about. All right, questions? Trying to keep looking back and forth to the chat in case somebody throws something in there. But all right, so the next thing, just for those of you who are new, normally these will be much more interactive. Today it's a lot of me talking, but in the future there will be things where I'll need you guys to actually participate because, if I'm going to design it myself, I don't have to do this class. Anyway, so driven design. We're going to talk about the driven design is what the script tells us to start with. That is our first resource when we see a show. The script gives us information. The person who wrote the play has already made choices about the world of that play. They have made the choices, and we generally just live with them, right? So, for an example, I have here the introductory stage directions for a show called Arcadia by Tom Stoppard. This is the first paragraph of 3 or 4 at the very beginning of the script. I'd like you all to take a moment and read that, and I will try to make that little thing that's covering some of the words go away. Take a moment and read that and think about what that tells us about our design choices. And I'll give you, a minute or two for that. All right, everybody get a chance to read through that? So what does this chunk of text tell us as designers about the world of this show? I'm going to start at the top and work my way down as the things that I would notice and probably take note of if I were designing this show. The first thing that comes to mind is that it is a room on the garden, a very large country house. That tells us that the world we're in is going to be a spacious place. They've got money. It's an open kind of set. The next thing is it's in Derbyshire. Derbyshire is in England, so that tells us a location. We can go online and search for Derbyshire and find out what does Derbyshire look like in the real world and use that to influence our design. The next thing that it tells us is that it's April 1809. So we've got a specific year and even a specific month. It's spring. That's going to influence our choices about what it looks like outside, what our qualities of light are. If we have windows, which We do, because we know that comes up in the next sentence or so. So we know a time of year and a specific year. As a costume designer, you're going to need to know, okay, what were the fashions of the turn of the 19th century there? What did people wear? And you're going to have to do some research on not only what the fashions of the time were, but the differences between working class people and more wealthy people, because obviously if we're talking about a very large country house, they're probably towards the wealthy end of the spectrum. And in fact, they are. We'll get to see some more of that. So we've got a very specific location, a specific chunk of England in a specific month in a specific year. So we're one sentence into this description, and we've already narrowed down our choices and our options to a very small chunk of the universe at large that we get to play with, right? So the next thing we'll notice is it gives some fairly specific instructions about what the set is. The upstage wall is mainly tall, shapely, uncurtained windows, one or more of which work as doors. So the writer of the play wants these tall windows. They're not supposed to be curtains, so it's open, it's bright, it's spring, so we know some more about the room this is supposed to be in. And one or more of which work as doors. Likely, when you see a description like that, that tells you that very likely the author has actors use that door at some point, right? So those doors could be very important as far as that goes. The next thing we see is that nothing much need be said or seen of the exterior beyond. So whatever is outside those windows doesn't play into the story. And in fact, the author wants that to not be a distraction for the show. All right? And then as we continue on reading our thing, perhaps we see an indication of this, perhaps only light, air, and sky. So that's sort of clarifying the previous thing, that what is outside those windows doesn't influence the world of the show. Whatever is outside those windows is purely decorative, and we don't want to draw the audience's attention outside. So when you combine that with the instruction about some of the windows are doors, you realize that although people may enter and exit from those points, that's all they're going to do. They're not going to hang out there. They're going to go through the door and walk off stage. And those are the sorts of things you need to be aware of as you process. So when you're reading a script as a designer, you're looking for those indications that tell you specific things about the story. The show, almost all scripts start off with some sort of description of the scenery. The one thing you have to keep in mind is a lot of times those instructions and the stage directions and that sort of thing that are in a script are not actually written by the author of the play, but are put in during the first production of the play. And they're based on whatever that first designer chose to do. So you can take them with a grain of salt, and working with the rest of your design team and your director, you may very well throw out some of those things and say, you know what, we don't need those windows. We're just going to leave it. We're not even going to have walls. It's just going to be an open, airy space. So, and the director may get a crazy idea in their head and say, instead of 1809, we're going to set it in 1999, which then shifts all of those decisions to a different frame. Okay? Any questions so far? All right. So continuing on. So the next thing is what the director tells us about our show. There's a lot. In the end, the director is the one who makes the final decision about the world of the show, what it means, what we're doing on the stage. So an example of this would be, here's a set design. Anybody have a guess what show this is for? And no cheating in using reverse image search. What if I tell you that set and this set are designs for the same show? Not the same production, but the same script. Anyone have any ideas yet? Feel free to throw them into the chat if you have them. Let's see if this one helps you any. Any guesses? These are all three productions of the same script. It might surprise you. Romeo and Juliet. So within the world, Shakespeare's notorious. People do Shakespeare and reset it in all kinds of different times and places and environments and worlds. And it's fantastic how much you can play with a script and shift it and make it fit different environments. So when we're looking at these sets, they're all sets that are built for the same show with the same script, but they're completely different worlds that we've created for the actors and for our audience to join us in. The first one, I'm going to actually go back so we can look at these in a little more detail. So this first one, it definitely has a 1970s vibe. You've got the disco ball. You've got this like stonework that sort of nods back to a historical thing, but you've got all this metalwork and framing around it that takes it out of that historical period. Looking at the costumes, you've got some very distinctive, it's clearly not Elizabethan costuming. So at some point, the director of this show made the decision, I want to set this in this kind of environment. I want to do these things with this script. And at the same time, this director made very different choices, where the other one has a very industrial kind of hard-edged look. This one looks almost Dr. Seuss-like, right? You got huge amounts of color. You've got bright lights. You've got bright color. You've got stripes. You've got all of this stuff going on around the stage. You've got this ladder over here, and even the ladder is lit up. So this show, and you've got a ladder here and a ladder here and scaffolding and stairs. This set, excuse me one moment. Sorry, I figured I would turn the mic off before I coughed. This set demonstrates a whole lot more movement potential for the actors. You've got all these different levels and things where the actors can be going up and down and climbing around. Excuse me. Climbing and moving and bright lights and all of this stuff. So it has a very different energy and flow to it. And then this last one is a much simpler set. You've got just a few platforms, a few curtains, and some lighting. And I'm guessing that these are not the costumes for the show. This is probably a rehearsal. But you can see it's a very simple toned down thing where in both of the first two shows, the set is almost a character in and of itself. The third one, the set is kind of built to just disappear behind the actors. When the actors aren't actively on that part of the set, you can turn off those lights and make it completely disappear. You can bring all of the audience's attention just to the actors very easily with a set like that. So there are a lot of choices to be made in terms of the design, even within the framework of our script. Does that make sense? Any questions? All right, so now the script has told us what it wants us to do. The director has told us what they want us to do. And then finally, after all of that, we actually get to make some art. We get to make some choices of our own. The script and the director's vision gives us a framework to build the world we want to build, right? So we're going to loop back to those different elements of design that we talked about before. So color. Color, you've got contrast versus coordination. You're going to have colors that clash with each other. When you put orange next to blue, there's a very distinctive choice there. You know, there's very strong contrast versus coordination, where you've got light blues and dark blues, and you're using them to help tell the story. Perhaps, you know, delineate different things, make things blend into each other to some extent or not. You can use color to sort of give you good versus bad guys. You know, the classic Western, good guys wear white hats, bad guys wear black hats. You can do that. You can do that in way less subtle ways. In our last production that happened right before we closed down, one of the things we talked about was there were different groups of characters in the show. And one group of characters, everybody in the group had some sort of green in their costume. And everybody in another group had some sort of red in their costume. And then there was a third group that was sort of floated between those two groups, and all of them had blue in their costume. And later in the show, some of those characters would have a small costume change where they put on like a vest or a jacket or a hat or something with the other color in it, and sort of showing a shift in their alignment, as it were, with the other cast members. Sometimes you go with things like, if you're doing a production of Romeo and Juliet, a lot of those productions, Montagues have a signature color. All of the Montagues have red in their costume, and all of the Capulets have blue in their costume. And everybody who isn't one of them has other colors, but there's always a distinctive, like, tells the audience this person is on this team, just like you would do for sports. You know, it makes it easier to tell who's on which team, and that can be really blatant or it can be really subtle. You know, if it's something where a character just has a certain color tie that is worn under a suit, jacket, and vest, you don't necessarily like register, okay, that person's wearing green, clearly they align with these people, but it's there and it sort of influences the audience's connection to things. You're also looking at realistic versus representational. So by that I mean, you know, if your set is set in a real location, do you paint the set to look like real brick or stone or whatever, or is it more cartoon-like? Are your color contrasts more distinct? Are your edges sharper to give you that like delineation? You know, if you think about images of, you know, a photograph versus a cartoon style image of the same thing, you've got very different uses of color and how those colors relate to each other. And then finally, you know, sometimes your color choice comes down to, I just like green. Why is this green? Because I like green. I like that color of green, and it works in this particular instance. There's no more reason to it than that. It's just, it works, and I like the color. You know, as a designer, that's your prerogative. You get to use the colors you like. So that's kind of how we make our color choices. The next thing we'll look at real quick is form. So we're talking about sizes, shapes, spaces, levels, all these different things that go into the space that our actors are in, the world that they live in. We did a show a few years ago where the characters were supposed to be, I believe, fourth graders. So one of the things we did is when we built desks for the classroom set, normal desk height is usually around 30 inches. We made all the desks 36 inches high, and they were just a little bit wider and a little bit taller, because not so much difference that the audience is looking and go, oh, those are big desks, just enough that when you put an actor behind it, you make that actor look smaller. And so you can sort of play with scale by playing with the sizes of things. You can emphasize things by making them bigger or smaller. You can, draw the audience's attention to different things by adjusting the size. With costumes, when you give a character a big flowing cape, you're drawing the audience's attention. You're making that person look bigger in relation to the amount of, they're not physically larger, but they're taking up more space on the stage. And that tells a story to the audience. The shapes of things, costuming comes to mind with this in terms of like a very natural, realistic type costume versus something where the proportions are exaggerated. Maybe you make the shoulders of somebody bigger, or you give them a taller heel on their shoe to change their proportion, change the shape of their silhouette. You choose a bigger, more flowing coat, a trench coat versus a more like windbreaker coat. All of those things change the shape of the person and help tell that story. And then for any of you who have taken any kind of art classes, one of the things that is involved is negative space, the open spaces you leave behind when you put your set in. Again, looking back at that third Romeo and Juliet set, there was a lot of open space there. And that kind of gives the actor something to play with, because fundamentally, the best set in the world, the most beautiful set in the world is useless if the actors can't actually perform on it. So the spaces you leave for the actors, the openings in the set, the script we looked at for Arcadia, where it talks about the tall, uncurtained windows, that tells you, that open space there is part of the world, and it tells the audience something about the world that your show is taking place in. And then levels. For those of you who will be attending Central, and those of you who already attend Central, Ms. Ritter loves some levels. She loves being able to put actors at different levels so that you can see people even when they're further back. You can move people around. You can give them a lot of opportunities to sit and stand and inhabit the world of the set. And that's an important aspect of, like, is the set just a room, or does it have, a raised platform somewhere? Or if we're outside, how much of the set is usable as walkways? How much of the set is usable as, places where you can put actors? It's a consideration both in terms of the design aesthetic, but also the fact that when you're doing a musical with 45 performers, you got to have somewhere to put all those people. And frequently you got to have somewhere to put all those people and have room for them to dance. So you have to take into account all of these different things as you go through your design. And if you have moving scenery, you also have to take that into account. You have to take into account, is there room to get this piece on and off the stage? Where does it go once it's off the stage? Because as much as we want the audience to be in that world, as designers, our world doesn't end at the edges of the set. It ends somewhere in the scene shop or the wings where our scenery lives when it's not on stage sometimes. And that all has to be taken into account with that. Any questions? Next up, movement. So there's literal movement, like I said. You move a piece of scenery on and off, you fly a curtain out, that sort of thing. But there's also like figurative movement. If you think about like the shapes of your set can sort of draw the eye. If you do a forced perspective thing, you're drawing the audience's eyes to a specific location. If you make part of the set look like it has some flowing waves to it or something, you can give the impression of movement without any actual movement. And the same with like lighting and sound, where you can make the environment feel like there's movement without actual physical movement. And there's the movement of your actors through that space. As an actor enters and leaves the stage, like how are they getting in and out of that world? Because again, fundamentally, we want to create a world for our performers to inhabit. So when somebody goes out a door, as a designer, we need to know what room are they going into? You know, when they're going out that door, where are they going? Because that world has to continue to exist. Because if there isn't something beyond that doorway for the actor, then there isn't going to be something beyond that doorway for the audience. So the actor has to know, when I leave this room, where am I headed, right? So you have to be able to sort of feel like, okay, this building is a grocery store. So when somebody exits through this door, they're going into a grocery store. And when they exit through this door, they're going into an apartment building or whatever, you know. So that has to figure into part of the movement of the set is where people are going. And then looking at things like fabric, for most of the Central students will know that for whatever reason, despite the fact that it frequently doesn't work out as well as I hope, I love putting fabric on my sets. Right now, Colby is rolling his eyes real hard because Colby got stuck with the fabric for our last musical, and it was, I'll be nice and say it was an exciting challenge for us. But fabric has a movement, and in fact, for our last musical, the fabric literally moved. We had fabric across the stage, and it moved around, and at the end of the show, it fell down and covered the set. At least that was the ideal situation. We hit it about 70% of the time, maybe by the end, which is another aspect of theater. Sometimes you have a great idea that just doesn't work, and you have to be willing to get rid of the idea. You can't be married to every idea you have. You have to be able to say sometimes just, nope, that didn't work, and it's gone. Right? That happens. Whether it's because something technically wouldn't work, something didn't work in terms of how it worked on the stage, it didn't match with other things on the stage. You know, sometimes that happens. But fabric also in terms of like costumes, like I mentioned before, you know, the same size and shape of dress could have a very different sort of movement if it's heavy, weighty fabric versus light, flowy fabric, right? And then, as we've talked about a couple of times now, lighting and sound both have movement as part of what they do. And that's not to dismiss the other aspects of design. I just, you know, I'm focusing on these main ones, but props, absolutely. There are props that move. There are props that have to be able to open and close or light up or that sort of thing, where that's a part of your design decision. Ashar posted, working with the fabric was difficult, but our first end result, it was great. So yeah, by the time we actually got to the point where the things were working the way we wanted to, it really did look very cool. It was a long, rough road to get there, but in the end, it was, I think, worth it. All right, any questions so far? All right, we'll keep on keeping on. We're getting closer to the end. Sound. Sound is obviously mostly within the domain of the sound designer, what with the name and all. And for most of the time, as a lighting designer, you don't want your stuff making sound. And as a scenic designer, you don't want your stuff making sounds. On the whole, those design aspects generally try to avoid sound. But sound does set an environment for you. There's environmental signs. Like me, I'm sitting in my apartment. There is a fairly major street out my front door. There's a brick wall from the building next door that's maybe 10 feet out my window. So I get lots of echo and carry from that street comes right in my window. They're closed right now because my air conditioning is on, but when those are open, I can hear every car go by. And it has a distinctive sound. But in addition to every car going by, there's kind of the background sound of cars going by on streets a block away. You've got airplanes that fly over occasionally. You've got all these different environmental sounds. There's a large tree just outside my window. So when it's windy, I get the sound of the wind through the leaves. And as a sound designer, you can build layers of sound that maybe are played back quietly enough that the audience isn't even really aware that they're there, but they help put the audience mentally into the space that you want them to be. If the show is set in a factory, maybe you want some background sound of machinery and clanking of tools and that sort of thing. So environmental sound is an aspect you can play with as part of your design. Then there's incidental sound. Some of them are motivated, like, for example, if somebody is supposed to answer the phone in the script, the phone probably needs to ring, because it's super awkward for somebody to just wander over and pick up a phone. And now with cell phones, less so, because we all keep our phones on silent a good chunk of the time, probably. I know I do. But that doesn't really work on stage. You need a motivation for the person to pull out their phone and talk. So usually if somebody's going to talk on a phone, you're going to need a ring. If there's somebody storms off, maybe you've got a door slam that happens. If there's, a storm going on and at some point in the script it calls for, a thunderclap or something, or you need to, even if the script doesn't specifically call for it, you need to set that environment and make the audience aware there's a heck of a storm going outside. So you're going to play rain and thunder and stuff like that potentially has to be cued to specific moments in the show. There's also just music. When you're doing a musical, obviously there's a whole lot of sound that has to happen. You've got a band, you've got your vocalists, you've got music playing, you may have recorded sound as well. But you may also, even in a show that's not a musical, you can have music as part of the show. In These Shining Lives that we just did, there was there's multiple parts of the show where they're listening to the radio, and there's a song that they talk about that recurs in their discussion throughout the show. So you have to have that music there. And then because we had that one specific song that's called for in the script, that influences our choices for any other music we want to use as background music when they're listening to the radio, or pre-show music, or things like that. And then the last thing is motivated. That kind of goes into the doorbell or gunshot or phone ringing or those sorts of things that are part of the business of the actors on the stage, that we are just reinforcing. Again, frequently those are things where you don't get a lot of artistic choice in them. They're just part of what we have to do to make the show happen. Questions? All right, next slide. Texture. So texture is a little bit harder to define in some ways because you don't generally think about texture on a day-to-day basis, but hard edges versus soft edges, rough and smooth things, warm and cool, which you may not think of as texture, but if you think about like a chunk of wood that is polished to an ultra smooth finish versus a piece of metal polished to the same level of smoothness, the actual physical texture is the same, but even without touching it, you see a difference in how like the wood looks warmer, the metal looks colder, it has a different feel to it mentally. Does that make sense? And then you've got organic versus synthetic, and that's not just in terms of like fabric. That would be like, leaves versus bricks, a man-made building versus a cave, how those shapes came to be in the world of your play. So you got to think about all of those sorts of things as you go. The same with like costumes and lights and like how you know, if your scene is supposed to be naturalistic and outdoors, you don't want any real hard shadows generally in your lighting, because you want those to be kind of organic and real to the world that you're in. All right, one more time. Any questions? No? All right, so the next thing I want you to do is this one. I do expect some responses to. Again, either in the chat or unmute and just say it. What does blue mean?
Sad, or it's a color.
Okay, I'm seeing cold, sad, nighttime. Blue is cold. All right, so is this blue? Is this the color you thought of when I first said blue? How about this one? Now, if you notice, you probably, when I showed the first one, thought of this as a pretty standard, middle of the road, typical blue. Next to this one, this blue starts to look more grayish, right? But what happens when we add this one to the mix? All of those colors are blue, right? They're all blue, but all of them are very different. So when you say to, if you are the scenic designer and you are talking to the lighting designer and you say, this image, this piece of scenery is going to be blue, if you are thinking about this blue and your lighting designer is thinking about this blue, there's a potential issue there, because you're going to be making different choices based on different information. And that is one of the biggest challenges in design, is that fundamentally we all speak a different language. And with it, so all of us have a definition of blue, but not all of our definitions of blue are the same. You know, I am fairly certain that at least one of our lighting people, when I said blue, thought of a gel color, a number and a letter combination. I'm going to guess somebody thought 74, because Colby said 64. Because that's how we define colors in lighting generally, is by their gel color. For any of you who are painters, you probably thought of something in terms of a paint color that you use. You know, we all have kind of a different thing. If you are a costume person, there's a real likelihood that you thought of a blue in a fabric. So part of our challenge is to make sure when we're talking to our other designers, and even more so the director, who doesn't necessarily speak a design language at all, make sure we're getting the information across. Now, the simplest way, obviously, if I am thinking of this blue, is to show this blue to the person I'm talking to. Then we know that's the blue I'm talking about. If I'm talking about this blue, again. So being able to communicate specifically does frequently mean changing how you process your thoughts and how you put them together in order to create the communication that you need as a designer. Okay, so we're going to do a quick exercise with that. Here is an image. It is a lovely painting that ties in nicely to our blue theme. So again, throw it in the chat or unmute or whatever. Describe this scene. Just single words, throw them out there. And I will read them out loud for the sake of the recording, because I'm assuming the recording does not record the chat as well. Lillian says gloomy. Hazel says old. very gloomy. Industrial. Gloomy as well. I will never take off points for spelling, just so you know. Depressing. All right, so those are some good words. You know, gloomy, industrial, depressing. So you all kind of, for the most part, got kind of a sad vibe out of it. And I think to some extent that can be generational, because I'm old enough to remember, you know, when traveling by train was a little bit more common. Not a lot more common. I'm not that old. And I certainly don't remember when steam engines were common. So don't get any crazy ideas. But, you know, to me, I don't get the same feeling of gloom. And it's just, I've always been fascinated by trains. I think trains are cool. So to me, I'm seeing, you know, a train station. I think it was Hazel said old. Yeah, a steam engine. It's not something that has been used with any regularity in about a century. So, you know, that is a valid assessment that it is a specific time in history. So, but the thing to keep in mind is that you didn't all come up with the same words to describe this scene. Even the people who didn't post, or, you know, I'm sure any of you who did post, you had more than just the one word or a couple of words you posted in your head that came to this. So if I gave you a picture like this and asked you to describe it to another person who couldn't see that picture, you'd have to work on getting some depth and some detail into that description. And that's one of the things that we have to do as designers, is be able to translate a visual element, a concept in our head, into something that we can share with other people who don't necessarily process the same emotions and the same thoughts into the same imagery. All of our experiences in the world are different. All of them are influenced by everything that we've been through as people, our upbringing, our environment, you know, our societal status. All of those sorts of things influence our decisions. And the great thing about that is that when you work with people in theater, you get exposed to a lot of those things that you wouldn't in your own life. And it gives you an opportunity to have conversations with people who are different, who have experienced different things in the world, different age groups, different ethnicities, different, all kinds of different things. And that's one of the best things about theater to me, is you have this opportunity to experience things that you wouldn't necessarily otherwise. You know, we get to build a whole new world for every show. And it gives us an opportunity to put something into this world that's never been there before. And, you know, I think that makes us real lucky as far as that goes. So, one more time, any questions? Anybody have any questions or thoughts or anything they want clarification on? All right, so, hey, I'm doing pretty good on time. At about an hour and a half, and here we are. All right. So the next part is homework. I mean, self-scheduled design refinement exercises. I'm not going to give you homework. It's summer, right? All right. So what I would like to do before we meet again tomorrow is choose an image, find an image online or in a magazine or whatever, and describe that scene. So if we were describing the train scene before, as if you were designing that scene for a production. So try to get as much of what the scene is into a text format that you can read. And like, say, if you had to email to the director, this is my vision of what this scene should look like. 5 sentences maximum. You know, concise is good. both in terms of I don't want you to spend a whole lot of time on it, and also I don't want to spend a whole lot of time reading them. It's more just to get you sort of into that design mindset and thinking about what the process is. All right, so I'm going to do this. All right, any other questions, any thoughts? Anybody have anything they want to chat about? All right, I am going to stop the recording now.